The blister packs in my hand weren't vitamins. They were poison. My mother-in-law had been drugging me for years, and my husband just handed me another dose. My fingers trembled as I pocketed the evidence, but the office door clicked open. David stood there, smiling, holding the glass of water that would wash down my next medication. The security app on my phone showed him watching from the balcony as the gardener tried to drag me back inside. I had one chance to run, but the car keys were still in the kitchen, and my husband knew it. The scent of charred rosemary and expensive brisket drifted across the manicured lawn, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of Eleanor's gin and tonic. Sarah reached into the butter-soft depths of her mother-in-law's Hermes Birkin, searching for the silver lighter Eleanor had dropped. Her fingers brushed past a silk scarf and snagged on something rigid, a strip of foil. She pulled it out. The blister pack lacked the professional branding of a pharmacy. Crude black ink smeared across the plastic bubbles, labeling pills that shimmered with an oily, synthetic sheen. Sarah traced the jagged edges. These weren't vitamins. A dull ache throbbed behind her eyes, echoing the rhythmic cramping that had haunted her for months. She recognized the chalky residue on the foil. It mirrored the bitter aftertaste of the morning tea Eleanor insisted on brewing. Laughter erupted from the patio. Eleanor leaned over the wrought iron railing, her diamonds catching the harsh Greenwich sun. "Find it yet, darling? The stakes are resting." Sarah slid the contraband into her palm, the sharp corners digging into her skin. Her pulse hammered against her collarbone. She slid the bag onto the stone bench and stood, smoothing her linen dress. Across the garden, her husband raised a glass, his smile practiced and hollow. The ice clinked in Eleanor's glass as she descended the stairs, her silk heels sinking into the sod. "The wind is picking up," Eleanor said, tucking a stray lock of Sarah's hair behind her ear. Her touch lingered, cold and dry. "You seem pale. Perhaps another cup of my herbal blend before dinner?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the hidden foil until the plastic crunched. "I think I've had enough, Eleanor." The afternoon sun felt like a spotlight, exposing every tremor in Sarah's hands. She looked back at the blister pack now tucked deep into her pocket. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. For 3 years, she had been poked, prodded, and scanned by the best fertility specialists in Connecticut. They had found nothing. No blocked tubes, no hormonal imbalances, just a mysterious inability to conceive. She had wept in the shower, blamed her own body for its failure, and let Eleanor comfort her with specialized teas and home-brewed supplements. Now, holding the jagged foil, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening mechanical precision. The mystery wasn't biological. It was chemical. Eleanor wasn't helping her build a family. She was systematically ensuring the Miller legacy remained under her own singular control. Sarah excused herself from the garden, the sound of the lawnmower next door humming like a distant warning. She retreated to her home office, a space of glass and steel that usually felt like a sanctuary of logic. She clicked the heavy oak door shut and leaned against it, her chest heaving. She pulled the kitchen timer from her pocket, the small, white plastic device that dictated her life. Click whir. She set it for 60 minutes. If she didn't feel a reaction to whatever she'd ingested at lunch by then, she would consider herself safe for the hour. She sat at her desk, the mahogany surface cold against her forearms. With trembling fingers, she typed the serial numbers from the blister pack into a private search engine. The results flooded the screen, a cascade of red flags and warnings. These weren't just contraceptives. They were high-dosage, black market hormone suppressants, often used in livestock or unapproved clinical trials to halt reproductive cycles entirely. Long-term use caused exactly what Sarah was experiencing: brain fog, chronic fatigue, and permanent infertility. The room seemed to tilt. The architectural blueprints on her wall, the designs for the perfect home, looked like a cage. She wasn't an architect here. She was a specimen in a very gilded jar. The door handle turned. Sarah didn't have time to close the browser before David stepped inside. He was carrying a tall glass of green liquid, the ice clinking with a rhythmic funeral sound. "There you are," David said, his voice smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of its own agency. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at her reflection in the window. "Mother noticed you didn't finish your lunch. We think you need your evening vitamins. You've been so erratic lately, Sarah. This will help level the variables." Sarah looked at the glass. The smell of kale and something bitter, something like crushed aspirin and copper, wafted from it. "I don't want it, David. We really should stay on the schedule," he insisted, stepping closer. The way he used "we" made Sarah's skin crawl. It was as if Eleanor was standing inside his head, pulling the strings of his jaw. "The doctor said consistency is the key to your recovery. Drink it." Sarah stood her ground, her back against the desk. "Which doctor, David? The one your mother pays? Or the one who hasn't been able to explain why I feel like I'm dying every morning?" David's boyish face hardened. The mask of the doting husband slipped, revealing a rigid, desperate compliance. "Don't be difficult. It's just a supplement. You're making a scene out of nothing. Just take the drink and let's go back to the party." In that moment, Sarah looked for a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a sign that he was being coerced. But there was only a cold, flat determination. He wasn't a victim of Eleanor's interference. He was the enforcer. He was the one holding the glass. He was the one watching her swallow the poison every single day. The realization was a second, deeper betrayal. The man she had shared a bed with for 5 years was her primary jailer. "Get out," she whispered. "Sarah, get out," she screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet house. David set the glass on the edge of her desk with a sharp clack. "We'll talk when you've calmed down. You're clearly not yourself." He turned and walked out, his gait stiff, leaving the green sludge to sweat a ring onto her blueprints. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed her purse, the blister pack, and her architectural portfolio. She had to get this evidence to a lab, not a Miller-funded clinic, but the 24-hour forensic facility in the city. She ran for the garage, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scrambled into her SUV, the leather seats hot against her legs. As she backed out of the garage, the tires crunched over the gravel. She reached the end of the long, winding driveway when a figure stepped from behind the towering boxwood hedges. It was Robert, the gardener. He wasn't carrying a rake or shears. He stood in the center of the path, his massive, calloused hands hanging at his sides. Sarah slammed on the brakes. "Move, Robert!" she yelled through the glass. He didn't move. He walked toward the driver's side door with a slow, predatory deliberate. Before Sarah could lock it, his hand shot out, gripping the handle. He yanked the door open with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a man his age. "Mrs. Miller," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "The mistress says you aren't fit to drive. Give me the bag." "Get away from me." Sarah kicked out, her heel catching him in the chest, but he didn't flinch. He reached inside, his fingers digging into her shoulder as he tried to drag her from the seat. The smell of bleach and damp earth filled the cabin. Sarah reached for anything. Her hand closed around the heavy, metal-edged corner of her architectural portfolio. As Robert lunged again, she swung it with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline she possessed. The sharp edge caught him square across the bridge of his nose. There was a sickening crunch. Robert recoiled, blood splattering the white leather interior. He let out a choked groan, clutching his face. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled the door shut, shifted into gear, and floored it. The tires spun, spitting gravel into the air as she swerved around his doubled-over form and tore toward the main road. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the wheel. She reached for her phone, intending to call the police, but her thumb hovered over the home security app instead. A notification had popped up. Movement detected on north balcony. She tapped the screen. The grainy, high-definition footage loaded. There, standing on the second-floor balcony overlooking the driveway, was David. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't running down to help her. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, watching the struggle below with the detached interest of a man watching a movie. When Sarah's car finally broke through the gates, he didn't move. He simply turned and walked back into the house, disappearing into the shadows of their bedroom. The silence in the car was deafening, save for the click-whir of the timer in her pocket. She was alone. Every load-bearing wall of her life had just collapsed, and the only thing left was the evidence in her purse. She drove through the night, the neon signs of the city blurred by the tears she refused to let fall. She reached the 24-hour clinic, a sterile, fluorescent-lit box that felt safer than her own home. She handed the blister pack to a technician who looked at her with clinical indifference. But Sarah didn't care. The chain of custody had begun. When she finally returned to the estate hours later, the house was dark, save for a single light in the living room. She walked in, her body aching, expecting silence. Instead, she found Eleanor sitting in the wingback chair, a set of legal papers spread across the coffee table like a deck of cards. "You've had a busy evening, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice a calm, clinical monotone. She didn't look up from the documents. "It's a shame. We tried to handle this with discretion. But your assault on poor Robert, it's left us with no choice." Sarah stood by the door, her hand on the frame for support. "I know what you've been doing, Eleanor. I have the pills. I have the lab report coming." Eleanor finally looked up, her silver hair shimmering under the lamp. She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. A lab report from a woman experiencing a documented mental breakdown? "David has already filed the paperwork, dear. Emergency medical conservatorship. Given your history of paranoia and today's violent outburst, the judge signed it an hour ago. You're being committed to the Weymouth Institute for evaluation. For your own safety, of course." "David wouldn't." "David did," Eleanor interrupted. "He's upstairs packing a few things for you. He's quite distraught. It's hard to watch the woman you love lose her mind." Sarah turned and bolted for the stairs, but she stopped. She needed her passport. She needed her cards. If she could get to the safe in the library, she could disappear before the transport arrived. She sprinted to the small hidden safe behind the law volumes. She punched in the code. Error. She tried again. Access denied. The safe had been wiped. Her passport, her emergency cash, her credit cards, all gone. She ran to the driveway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as she reached her secondary car, she saw the ruin. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping like open mouths. The perimeter was closed. The Millers didn't just own the house. They owned the very ground she stood on. Robert? Sarah whispered into the darkness of the garage. A shadow moved near the back of the basement stairs. The gardener, the doctor, stepped into the light. His nose was taped, his eyes bruised and filled with a cold, professional hatred. He held a heavy length of galvanized pipe. "The mistress says you need to rest now," he said. Sarah backed away, her heels clicking on the concrete. She retreated into the basement, the only place left to run. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and wood polish. She scrambled behind a row of storage crates as Robert descended the stairs, the pipe dragging against the railing with a rhythmic ting-ting-ting. "I know who you are," Sarah yelled, her voice echoing in the rafters. "I know you're not a gardener. You're a disgraced MD. Eleanor is paying you to cook those supplements in the tool shed, isn't she?" Robert didn't answer. He lunged, the pipe whistling through the air where Sarah's head had been a second before. It smashed into a wooden crate, splintering the pine. Sarah scrambled toward the wall, her hand catching on the cold metal of a fire extinguisher. She yanked it from the bracket. As Robert swung again, Sarah pulled the pin and squeezed the handle. A deafening hiss filled the room as a cloud of white, pressurized powder exploded into Robert's face. He screamed, clutching his eyes, the pipe clattering to the floor. Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She spotted the old coal chute, a narrow, soot-stained tunnel used for deliveries a century ago. She scrambled up the brick ledge and shoved herself into the darkness. The soot scraped her skin, and the air was thin and choked with dust. But she pushed, her fingers clawing at the rough metal. She burst through the exterior hatch and tumbled onto the wet grass of the backyard, gasping for air. As she rolled over, her hand brushed against something soft, a leather jacket. Robert must have dropped it during their earlier struggle. She grabbed it and crawled into the shadows of the hedges. Inside the pocket, she felt the weight of a small book. She opened it under the faint glow of the garden lights. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Page after page of chemical formulas, dosage logs, and, most importantly, payment tallies from Miller and Associates. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just about her. The ledger detailed Trial Group A and Trial Group B. Names of other prominent Greenwich women were listed next to chemical codes. Eleanor wasn't just poisoning her daughter-in-law. She was running an illegal clinical trial, using the family law firm to funnel insurance money into a purity project. Sarah was just the closest specimen. She had to get to the firm. The physical ledger was good, but the digital records, the emails, the bank transfers, those were the nails in the coffin. Subverted Beat 3.1. Sarah arrived at the glass and steel monolith of Miller and Associates at 3 a.m. Her clothes were stained with soot. Her forehead was grazed. But she had her old employee keycard clutched in her hand. She had worked here as an intern years ago, before she married David. She knew the security rotation. She knew that at this hour, the front desk was usually manned by a single guard who spent most of his time watching baseball highlights in the break room. She swiped the card. The light flickered green. Thank God. She slipped inside, the lobby smelling of expensive floor wax and stale air conditioning. Her plan was simple, logical, and backed by years of knowing the firm's layout. She would go to the third-floor records room, download the digital backups of the Special Projects folder, and be out before the sun rose. She was an architect. She understood the flow of a building better than anyone. This was her turf. She felt a surge of genuine hope. For the first time in days, she was the one in control. As she reached the elevator bank, she heard a soft chirp from the security console. She froze. A small green light on the panel began to pulse. It was the visitor acknowledged signal. "Welcome back, Sarah," a voice boomed over the intercom. It wasn't the guard. It was Eleanor. The lobby doors behind her hissed shut. A heavy electronic thud echoed through the marble hall, the sound of the emergency deadbolts engaging. Sarah lunged for the doors, but they were solid. She turned back to the elevators, pressing the button frantically. The doors opened, but as she stepped inside, the lights flickered red. "Did you really think I wouldn't track your card usage?" Eleanor's voice was smooth, almost bored. "I've already called the police, dear. I reported a disgruntled, mentally unstable former associate breaking into the building with intent to commit arson. They'll be here in 4 minutes. And look at you. Covered in soot, eyes wild. You look exactly like the monster I described." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every heartbeat. Sarah's heart plummeted. Her smart move, using her old access, had been the very trap Eleanor needed to finalize the conservatorship. By trying to gather evidence legally, she had just provided the Millers with the proof of her insanity. She wasn't the whistleblower anymore. She was the criminal. The world tilted as the blue and red lights began to splash against the lobby windows. She was trapped. She didn't have 4 minutes. She had seconds. She jammed her finger into the maintenance button, a trick she remembered from the building's renovation. The elevator didn't go up. It dropped 6 inches, and a small service hatch in the ceiling popped open. She scrambled up the railing, her fingers catching on the greasy metal, and hauled herself into the dark crawl space just as the lobby doors were kicked open. "Police! Hands in the air!" Sarah pressed her face against the cold ductwork, her breath hitching. Below, she could hear the heavy boots of officers thumping across the marble. "She's not here. Check the stairwells." She crawled through the darkness, the smell of dust and old wires filling her nose. She reached a junction and saw a faint light through a grate. She peered down into a small IT closet. Inside, a woman was frantically clicking a metal pen. Click, click, click. "Happy birthday to you," the woman whispered. It was Jennifer, the firm's lead tech. Sarah remembered her, the girl who obsessed over hand sanitizer. Sarah kicked the grate open and dropped into the room. Jennifer screamed, nearly falling off her chair. "Sarah, oh my God, you're bleeding." "Jennifer, listen to me." Sarah grabbed her arm. "The Millers, the special projects folder, they're poisoning people. They're poisoning me. I have the ledger." Jennifer's eyes went wide. She looked at the door, then back at Sarah. She reached into her desk and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. "I know. I've been watching the data spikes for months. I was too afraid to say anything. They killed my sister, Sarah. Not like this, but through neglect. I've been waiting for someone to actually show up." She shoved the drive into Sarah's hand. "This is Eleanor's private server. Everything. The emails, the payments to the doctor, the clinical trial results. Get out of here. Use the service elevator. It's not on the main grid." Sarah took the drive, the cold metal biting into her palm. "Thank you." "Go," Jennifer whispered, already turning back to her screen to wipe the logs. "Happy birthday to you." Sarah reached the penthouse boardroom on the 40th floor. This was where the main server rack was housed. She needed to initiate a full cloud upload of the data on the drive to ensure it couldn't be deleted. She burst into the room, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. She jammed the drive into the server. Upload starting. 2%, 4%. It's a long way down, isn't it? Sarah spun around. Eleanor was standing by the massive mahogany table. She held a small, professional-grade syringe. The liquid inside was a clear, viscous amber. "The police are searching the lower floors," Eleanor said, stepping forward. Her silver hair was perfect, her silk suit unwrinkled. "By the time they get here, you'll be fast asleep. And when you wake up at Weymouth, you won't remember a single thing about a ledger or a flash drive. The Miller treatment is very effective at erasing inconveniences." "Stay back." Sarah grabbed a heavy glass award from the table. Eleanor laughed. "You're an interloper, Sarah. A peasant we invited into our home because we thought you had the right architectural mind to build our legacy. But you're flawed. You're weak. You think truth matters in a world built on foundations of gold." She lunged with a speed that defied her age. Sarah swung the award, but Eleanor dodged, the syringe grazing Sarah's arm. They crashed into the server rack, sparks flying as wires were torn loose. Sarah felt the cold bite of the needle's tip against her skin, and she screamed, kicking out with all her might. She caught Eleanor in the shin, sending the older woman stumbling back toward the massive glass windows. Sarah lunged, grabbing Eleanor's wrist and twisting it until the syringe fell to the carpet. Sarah pinned her down, her knee pressed into Eleanor's chest, holding the needle just inches from Eleanor's throat. "Give me the codes, Eleanor. End this." "Or what?" Eleanor spat, her face contorted in a mask of pure, aristocratic rage. "You don't have the stomach for it." The door to the boardroom clicked open. Sarah looked up, her heart leaping with a final, desperate hope. David, help me. She has the sedative. She's been poisoning me." David stood in the doorway. He looked at his mother on the floor, then at Sarah. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "David, please," Sarah sobbed. "Tell her to stop. We can go. We can leave this place." David stepped into the room, his reflection caught in the glass. He didn't move toward his mother. He moved toward Sarah. "I can't do that, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "Why?" "David, she's killing me." "We didn't want a family with a girl like you, Sarah," David said. He stopped a few feet away, his hands hanging limp. "You were supposed to be the face, the pretty architect who stayed in her lane. But you started asking questions. You started wanting things that weren't in the plan." Sarah's grip on the needle faltered. You knew?" "Of course he knew," Eleanor hissed from the floor. "He helped me measure the doses. He's a Miller, Sarah. He knows that an inheritance is worth more than a working-class wife who can't even keep her own blood clean." David looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows. "The trust fund only triggers if the bloodline is pure and the reputation is intact. You were becoming a liability. Mother is right. You need to rest." He moved toward her, his eyes cold and empty. He wasn't the man she loved. He was just another load-bearing wall in Eleanor's empire. Sarah looked at the syringe, then at the server rack. Upload. 98%. 99%. Complete. She didn't use the needle on Eleanor. She lunged for the wall. She knew the building's blueprints. She knew that this boardroom was an addition, built over the original HVAC hub. She grabbed the emergency fire axe from the wall and smashed the glass casing of the ventilation override. "What are you doing?" David shouted. Sarah slammed the override button. "I built this floor, David. I know where the cracks are." A deafening roar filled the room as the fire suppression system engaged. Not water, but halon gas. A thick, white, Oxygen-depleting fog poured from the vents. It blinded them instantly. Eleanor and David began to cough, their voices lost in the roar of the gas. Sarah pulled her shirt over her nose and dropped to the floor, where the air was still clear. She crawled toward the service stairs, her fingers finding the emergency bypass code she had memorized years ago. Click. The door opened. She tumbled into the stairwell and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the street. She didn't call the police. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the one place the Millers couldn't reach with a phone call: the National News Network. 6 months later, the wind off Lake Michigan was biting. A sharp, clean cold that made Sarah feel more alive than she had in years. She stood in a small, sterile clinic in the heart of Chicago. The scent of bleach was there, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a beginning. Dr. Scott walked in, the crinkle of a sugar packet in his pocket. He looked at his chart, then at her. "The results are back, Sarah," he said, his warm voice filling the room. "The toxins are completely gone. Your endocrine system has fully stabilized. You're healthy." Sarah looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, a forest of steel and glass that she was helping to redesign. She had her own firm now, small but clean. "And the long-term effects?" she asked. Dr. Scott smiled. "Your body is resilient. You're the architect, remember? You rebuilt the foundation just in time." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sugar packet, and wrote on it: Tuesday. Sarah's new life. Sarah walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The perfect home wasn't a building in Greenwich. It wasn't a legacy built on poison and silence. It was the air in her lungs, the strength in her hands, and the quiet, steady ticking of a heart that finally belonged to no one but herself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old kitchen timer. She looked at it for a long moment, then dropped it into a trash can on the corner of Michigan Avenue. She didn't need to count the minutes anymore. She had all the time in the world. The end. Do not proceed past this point.